Welcome to the Fat Tony's podcast, where we bridge the gap between everyday life and expert insight. Join us in conversation with real-world experts, gaining practical advice and strategies to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Awesome. Okay, Marc Ross, welcome to Fat Tony's.
Hey, great to be here. I love Fat Tony. I also love a good neon cocktail sign, so this is good. We're off to a good start.
Wow. Well, this is the first time we've spoken face-to-face, albeit virtually, but we've been interacting for a while over Twitter. I know you as the man who is always communicating. For the benefit of any listeners that don't know you, could you just give us a little bit of detail about you and your background?
Sure. I mean, I would say my background is I have a real love for politics, marketing, human behavior, elections, business, and professionally, for the last 25 years, I've really worked at the intersection of, I would say, business and politics. And that is everything from advancing legislation to killing legislation to helping people get elected to not helping people get elected. And it's super interesting. It's super fun. It involves, at this level now, I do a lot of work around globalization and geopolitics. So I think a lot about what's happening in Beijing, New Delhi, London, Brussels, DC, and kind of that intersection of that world. If you think about like what happens in the Financial Times on a daily basis, like that's kind of the world I live in. And for the last I'd say 8 years, I've really been focused on communications, helping all kinds of organizations, senior executives really think about how to communicate in this very hybrid global business environment. And one of the mantras I have is ABC, always be communicating. And to me, communications isn't really just, sending press releases or talking to reporters or writing the occasional opinion editorial. It's really like a state of being. It's really kind of a vibe, when Pharrell walks into the room, he's communicating, right? When an aircraft carrier sails in the Red Sea, that's like definitely sending a message. So this idea around always be communicating is just kind of embodying everything from the way you look, the way you dress, the way you speak, the way you communicate, the tools, and just like everything we're doing is communications, which I find really interesting.
That's really interesting. I think you're absolutely right. Now more than ever, what started with what I consider to be reality TV, maybe in the late 90s and early noughties, in some ways, it's like we're all on a reality TV show all the time now. We are criticized and judged in so many ways that we wouldn't have been 20 or 30 years ago. I suppose the first question I have for you, and we talked about communications, we talked about politics, there's a lot in there. There are a lot of people right now who are trying to, in one way or another, communicate. They're trying to either build a personal brand or they're trying to, build a business or communicate themselves either locally or on a national stage. I want to talk a little bit about communicating at the tails. I mean, in your point of view, in your experience, is it better to kind of have a niche audience of absolute evangelists? Or is it better to have a kind of larger, bigger, but more general following?
Yeah, I think I'm going to probably not give you a satisfactory answer, but it depends on the context. So if you're General Motors, like you're going to sell, average cars to average people, and you need to sell a lot of them, right? So your communications is going to be pretty general. Whereas if you're Porsche, you're only going to sell like 250,000 cars every year. And in fact, Porsche is so crazy that here in the States, they make sure that they don't sell too many cars in a zip code, right? Because they want to keep that exclusivity. Both are very interesting. Both are very successful. Both have different communication patterns and different communication challenges, GM and Porsche, even though they're both selling cars, right? But it's how they're communicating, how they're telling the story. So what I tell people is really it starts like with what the strategy is. Like, what are you actually trying to do? And what do you know that nobody else in the world knows, right? And how can you amplify that and then go from there? But the challenge is when you go, like I prefer to go niche because I think there's a lot more, it's more interesting, it's more focused. There's that famous article 1,000 True Fans that was written a few years ago, Kevin Kelly. And he, from a creator standpoint, he's like, yeah, you only need 1,000 true fans and you can have a pretty robust business. But if you're General Motors, you got to sell a lot of cars. So it gets back to the context. There's really no right or wrong, but in the delivery of the messaging is what really matters. There's another example I talk about, like the Food Network.
The medium is the message is something that I forget the guy who said it, but I had that Barnum-Meinhof effect where someone mentioned it to me recently, and now I keep seeing it again and again.
No, yeah, it's Marshall McLuhan. He's a Canadian communicator, and he talked about that in the 60s, and yeah, no, it's like that's super important. Like if I send you an invitation via email versus the invitation via post with heavy stock, fancy paper, they carry a different weight, right? Like if King Charles invites you to Buckingham Palace and he invites you via email to a garden party, it's pretty cool. But if he invites you with like stationary, hand delivered, all the razzmatazz, that carries a lot more weight. So, and you could think of, if getting back to the GM Porsche example, like GM is going to communicate by email, digital, Super Bowl ads, kind of big splashy advertisements, right? Where Porsche is probably going to be at a polo event, a wine tasting, very exclusive, high end, all that kind of stuff. And they're both communicating, but the way they do that, to your point, that you have to use different tools to tell that story, to make that connection.
Interesting.
What I find with the entrepreneurs is they just try to throw up a lot of ideas. They haven't made the critical decision around the strategy of what they're trying to be. Are they trying to be mass? Or are they trying to be niche? And then if you make that decision, that really dictates the tools and, to your point, the mediums that you're going to use to kind of tell your story.
You mentioned story a couple of times there, and maybe to a certain extent, personal story. Now, maybe this is just hindsight bias, but I've seen, or I think I've seen, that kind of importance of having a personal story really come front and center in the last sort of 20 years, shall we say. And I'm wondering now, we had a little bit of a chat about social media, but I'm wondering to what extent is that a result of the times that we live in that, we've all got multiple social media profiles now. We're in a marketplace, a communications marketplace, which is more crowded than ever. Everyone's making noise. And is that human story the way to cut through the noise, do you think?
Yeah, I said this the other day. I sat in my buddy Greg Bunch is a professor at the University of Chicago, the Booth Business School, and he teaches a class on entrepreneurship. And I threw out this line, which I've been kind of thinking about. Basically, the more that we go technical or technology, the more humanity is going to like almost be a killer app. That is, this is great that we're doing this, transatlantic, via the internet, all that kind of using tech. But obviously, I think it would be a much more robust, interesting discussion if we were in person, right? So it's that fine balance of how do you use tech to make yourself more human, if that makes sense. And I think the reason why stories win is because we're hardwired as creatures to listen to stories, tell stories, and connect with people. And we've been doing it since we've been gathering around a fire forever, and we're just wired that way. And stories just make it more relatable, more connection, and, you can build from there. It's just such a powerful tool. It's such a powerful tool because that's how we've learned to survive on this planet. And people that discount stories are missing, I think, a real opportunity, not only to connect with people, but also to dissuade people. Seb, as you know, when you build a business, and many times you want to get to no as fast as you want to get to yes, right? I mean, that is like, you don't want to be for everybody. You can't be for everybody. And in some ways, getting people to say no to you early improves your sales cycle, right? Because then you can only really focus on the people that care about you and connect with you. And that's where a story can make a huge difference.
It's really interesting. I was one of the guests we had on recently. I don't know if you follow him, Jim O'Shaughnessy, kind of a bit of a Wall Street legend, but we were talking about stories. And I have a personal theory that the reason we're so attuned and receptive to stories, and the reason we evolved to love them so much, is that kind of like they're the ultimate compression algorithm in a way. There's like a fractal nature to them. You can tell a story with a meaning or a parable, and you can tell that story in 2 minutes. Or you can tell the same story and extrapolate it to a 3-hour blockbuster movie or a 600-page novel. So I think they have this amazing compression algorithm in them, and they really do resonate with them. Even now, I don't know what it's like in the US, but even on game shows in the UK now, every contestant has to have a story. And there's always like this 2-minute talking head, this is my sob story, or this is where I come from. And you just did not see that 20 years ago. It's really fascinating to me just how important it's becoming as kind of a tool to grab people's attention.
O'Shaughnessy's great, man. That's awesome. I love listening to his podcast. That's cool you got him. And it just made me think about this Truman Capote quote where he said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And, you know, he was always criticized for being a fiction writer, but maybe also being a nonfiction writer and combining the two. But there's something to be said about that. I mean, just the thing of a story just connects people and it lets you know that you're human. And I just think humanity is going to be a really interesting tool. And there's nothing more human than telling a story.
Yeah, it's interesting. It may also be a backlash against, you know, tech becoming more and more dominant. Maybe our methods of communication becoming a little bit more impersonal than they were, that we're kind of now going back and putting more importance on the meaning of story as a way to kind of bring back a little bit of humanity into the way we communicate.
Well, and there's so many tools now too, right? Like I was in a meeting yesterday and, you know, this team that I'm working with, we're connected on text, phone, you know, email, Slack. And then somebody's like, oh, we were chatting about that on Signal. And, you know, my colleague was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I'm not on Signal. Like, do I need to go on another platform? Like, I mean, how many tools do we need? There's like 6 of us. Like, why do we need 17 tools to communicate? And that was all, like that meeting happened. The only reason that even came out is because we were meeting face to face. And it's interesting. We have all these tools, but we're not communicating any better. In fact, communicating face to face is still the best way to go.
Yeah. I mean, you see, you know, during and after the pandemic, you saw a lot of these influencers, or I did on Twitter, saying, oh, you know, I used to fly 60 days a year, 80 days a year, but now I can just do my meetings over Zoom. But, you know, humanity is more complex than that. It's easy to look at a black box and say, oh, we can just do it this way. But I think you're right. You're going to see these after effects. And the same for remote working as well. And I know you could have a whole hour debate on remote working versus office working. And I'm sure there's benefits to both. But every time we have a kind of efficiency shortcut, there is a question of, are we losing a little bit of humanity here? For me as well, I think maybe this goes in tandem, but maybe this is slightly different. But as well as kind of the era of story and interpersonal trying to cut through the ways we communicate, it definitely feels like we're also living in the era of big personalities, especially politically. I mean, you've had Trump, you've had Johnson, even in business, you know, Musk, you know, probably the most eccentric business guy since Howard Hughes, maybe. And it really feels like we're in this era of you have to have a large personality. You don't just have to be good at what you do anymore. You have to have a large personality. And I want to ask you, you know, what do you think the world is going to look like in the next couple of years as we're going into potentially a second Trump presidency, as we're seeing Musk take center stage more and more and larger personalities? Do you think this trend is going to continue?
Yeah. I mean, yes, for one main reason. Like if you actually so I know a lot of producers and reporters at CNBC and Bloomberg, and you know, CNBC can only talk about 500 publicly traded companies, right? Mm-hmm. For a handful of reasons. One of them is like they only want to talk about brand names that the audience knows, right? And the second thing is like they're not really in quote unquote the speculation business, so they're not going to talk about like penny stocks or biotech or, you know, kind of frontier companies that, you know, there are thousands of publicly traded companies. But like at the end of the day, if you watch like business news, they only talk about like known personalities, and that is like amplifying. And I just sent you this DM via Twitter, Seb. You can check this out, but you know, the amount of attention that Musk, Zuckerberg, Bob Iger, Tim Cook get, like just far outstrips like any other CEO. And it's becoming like a self-perpetuating loop where the only people that are talked about are the people that are well known. And that's like because there's so much competition to get attention that news networks are kind of like only reporting on the people that everybody knows, right? And it's really not impossible, but to break through, this takes a lot of time and fortitude. And we are entering this age of kind of global mass communication. I mean, I think the world that we live in, you know, New York, London, DC, Tokyo, Paris. I mean, there are like 10 cities that are basically all having the same conversation, and we're all reading the same stuff and we're all connected, right? So this combination of global interconnectivity, pressure to get attention, also restrictions on what media can actually talk about, because they too want to tell a story about people that everybody knows, right? So we're in this age of celebrity politicians, celebrity CEOs, that's being reinforced in many ways by the algorithms and also by the media companies and the reporters themselves. Like this stat I just sent you, like Musk got out of one point, like this analysis, I forget who did this analysis, but out of 1,000,042 articles about the auto industry, 1.27 of them, right? Nearly, what's that? I don't know, 90% were like about Musk. We're about Musk, right? And the next one was Farley at Ford and Mary Barra at GM. And, is Musk he is more interesting certainly than Mary Barra and Jim Farley as a personality, but is he more important as a news source? I mean, Ford and GM employ more people, they're more global, etc. But Musk is far more interesting. So you can just see, like, if CNBC or Bloomberg or FT or The Economist have to talk about somebody, they're probably going to talk about Musk before they talk about Mary Barra because Musk is more entertaining.
Yeah. There's a few threads there that I'd love to pick up on. I think, number one, there's this kind of celebritization, for want of a better, is that a real word? I don't know, but of CEOs. And that had always happened in the past to a certain extent, but it's in overdrive now. And also kind of like, these financial shows almost turning into almost like gossip columns. And again, we're seeing stories. People love stories. People love gossip. And maybe these vehicles of communication have changed again because we're in such a more competitive marketplace. And you talked about globalization and kind of one world narrative. I think there was, the Steve Jobs biography, is it Walter Isaacson that he wrote? I think there's a story in that where Steve was in Turkey, I believe, and he saw some teenagers with an iPod, and he had this realization that the world he grew up in, where you had a Turkish teenager or an American teenager or a British teenager, no longer existed. You just had a teenager. And I think we're definitely seeing that with everything, absolutely everything. This type 1 civilization where we have type 1 stories, which are globally relevant stories.
No, I'm spot on with you. I'm a huge, soccer / football fan, and I played, and I've been watching or doing something around soccer, and obviously in the States it's like growing, but you'll see as many kids wearing like Mbappe shirt, a Kane shirt as any of our, like a LeBron jersey in the States. And I think about the global aspect of it and just how easy it is now to watch international soccer anytime in real time, and that kind of spread and how these stories can be told. One of my favorite quotes is like, culture follows power. So it's not surprising that, Arsenal jerseys are seen all over the world, right? I mean, it's a combination of geopolitical power, soft power of the UK, but also the ability for Arsenal to broadcast around the world.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be discounted. I mean, that's super powerful.
One of the most irritating things that I hear in Europe, because, a lot of Europeans can be slightly derogatory to the US at times. And I hear it time and time again. It's like, oh, well, the US has no culture. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about? Look, the 20th century is the history of US culture. And the 21st century, increasingly as well, is US culture. And I think you're absolutely right. Culture follows power. I'm almost the inverse of you, Mark. When I was a kid in the 90s, I really loved NFL. Me and my buddies at school, we had a small little NFL fan group. And it was really unusual back then. Like nobody in the UK.
No, I'm sure. That's like, you're like pioneer, man. That's pretty wild.
Yeah. But now it's huge.
Yeah.
And, we have the exhibition games in London. And again, part of that's organic, part of that's due to a huge marketing push by the NFL, and there are rumors they want to establish a permanent franchise in London. But again, that just tallies into exactly what you're saying. Culture follows power. And it's fascinating to me how we're seeing just everything become more and more interconnected and just play with each other in really fascinating ways.
I'm curious, you're a longtime NFL fan, and how do you feel about all these newcomers? Is your fandom become less of the NFL because more people are fans of it?
No, I like it. I'm not one of these people who is like, well, I knew the band before they were cool.
Yeah.
And is a little bit pretentious about it. But no, I love it. And what's really interesting, Mark, is I speak to a lot of my friends now. I was like, well, if there was a London franchise, and the rumor is it's going to be Jacksonville Jaguars coming over at some point. If there was one, would you support, the London Jaguars? And without exception, every single one of my friends has said, no, I've got my team, whether that's, the 49ers or the Eagles or whatever, and that's my team. So I wouldn't switch to. I was like, what? Even if they're a UK team, and they're like, no, absolutely not. And I think that echoes the slight cultural difference between UK football and American football, which is, in the UK, if a team tried to move to a different city, there would be a riot. Whereas the franchise system in America is a bit more fluid towards teams moving.
I want to this gets back to the fandom idea about F1 is expanding here in the States, and there's a lot of new fans, and there's getting blowback, and who's a true fan? It's interesting because as these getting back to the GM Porsche example, or your point earlier about having 1,000 true fans, you decide to go niche, and then you cross over and you become popular. Is that a bad thing? Have you lost your way? I always think about Tommy Hilfiger, right? They were super popular, and then it became ubiquitous. Then it wasn't as cool. But this is a real challenge for brands, how do you maintain, what are you trying to do? And can you maintain that mystery if that's what you're trying to go after? But at the same time, you want to expand and grow and sell more stuff. It's fascinating. The expansion idea, right? As opposed to or do I just stay niche and local? Do I just play at my small pub, or do I try to get a record contract?
I completely agree. It's interesting the way, what's the best way of saying this? Almost like the way grassroots support or grassroots attitudes can differ between cultures. I have a question for you related to politics, actually. This might be a nice segue for this, but there's been so much talk and debate about the difference between UK politics and US politics, or UK politicians and US politicians. I wanted to put a little bit of a spin on that. And from your point of view and the work you've done, have you seen a difference between a UK voter and a US voter, and maybe either attitudes or the way they would be swayed, or beliefs, or do you think they're fundamentally similar?
So I think most voters and most politicians are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think that stuff that's happening even in France, Germany, the UK will end up in the States and vice versa. So I do think there's kind of I think democracy generally is kind of the same, and politicians are generally the same. They want to stay in power. So I think the mechanics are the same. Where it gets interesting is the cultural aspect of it. I mean, here in the States, we have so many elected offices. Yeah. I mean, from literally county sheriff all the way to the president. I mean, there are thousands of elected jobs in this country. So there's elections happening constantly. And our First Amendment, the freedom of speech, all that stuff is kind of wrapped into it. We're constantly having campaigns, right? Whereas obviously the UK has got a different system. It's limited 6-7 weeks. There's less money that can be spent, etc. So I think the mechanics are slightly different and the cultural aspects are different. But I think at the end of the day, there's a lot, if you're a politician running in a democracy, there are a lot of core aspects that are no different if you're in Germany, Ireland, Canada, United States.
Yeah.
And same with voters. Voters at the end of the day, especially in democracies, are is my life better? Can you make it better? Are you representing me? And that's what it comes down to. So I think there's a lot of overlap. And I think I advise a lot of my friends to pay attention to what's happening in other countries as test models, kind of see where the world's going. Getting back to that point too, we're so much more interconnected now. And it's so easy, it's so easy to follow UK politics, German politics, Norwegian politics, Finnish politics with the tools that there's no excuse for it, or it's easier. But I think there's always I always find experts want to make it a black box. Only I understand UK politics, or only I understand French politics. But I think if you've got a good core understanding of the mechanics of democracy, you can be successful anywhere. Now, you might not know all the nuances and the culture aspects, but I think if you've got a good grounding and foundations, same with marketing and communications, I think there's a lot of stuff that isn't special to any nationality or any country.
I think, I could totally understand that. At the end of the day, I think what you're saying is human nature is universal, and human nature is the same everywhere, even taking into account certain cultural differences. So at the heart, people are going to always act the same. And, going back to ancient Athens, politics, if you read, if you go back and read some of those speeches, you look at Cicero, Cato, even Caesar, not much has changed, right? You've got populists, you've got conservatives or traditionalists, and they've been locked in this battle for 4,000 years, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years.
And the same, I do a lot of work on the U.S.-China relationship, and people will be like, oh, Beijing, the Communist Party, it's a black box. And I'm always like, no, they've got factions, just like we have factions. They have blue states, red states, just like we do. They have like hardline conservatives. They have less hardline, communists. There's no monolith, like the Catholic Church, Communist Party, the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, like they're all on the spectrum. And I think you're right. There's like stuff that's been happening for thousands of years that are just wired into human nature that you shouldn't discount. And you shouldn't be so mystified. I think a lot of times experts, like getting back to that point, like only I understand this, like only I can decipher the wizard, get you to the golden, I'm trying to think of some good analogies, get you to the touchdown, right? Like blah, blah, blah. But I think if you step back and look at human nature in general, there's a lot of overlaps. And I think that's why like the behavioral economists and just understanding humans or thinking more about how humans normally act is that to me is a real special skill, regardless of the system that they're operating in.
Yeah, that's interesting. What I love about these chats is the way things start feeding into each other without you realizing it. And what I'm thinking now with having you said that is, human nature is a black box to a certain extent, and we're finding more and more out about that. But the explosion in social media that we talked about earlier has probably accelerated the largest laboratory for that we've ever had. And we're learning more and more about engagement, more and more about hijacking attention, more and more about maintaining people's attention and swaying their opinion than we ever have, because we've got, 3-4 billion people interacting daily now, trillions of interactions, and we're able to tinker and derive results from that. And we've ended up with what I think is almost like the fentanyl of attention, which is TikTok, which I resisted for a while. And I finally downloaded TikTok. My girlfriend is obsessed with it. And I downloaded it a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not exaggerating for effect here. I looked up and an hour had passed. And it was like, whoa. So I deleted it immediately because it scared me. It just scared me how absolutely consuming it is. And this is, coming from a guy who spends, a good portion of his week on Twitter. So it's not like I'm anti-social network. But I think we're getting to that point. And, are we seeing this reflected in politics to a certain extent? Because question I see, on this side of the pond, going into an election cycle, and again, we've got Trump versus Biden, right? We're here again 4 years later, and Fat Tony's was actually founded on the election night of Trump versus Biden as kind of an election party, an online one that is still going. The question we have, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, and I mean this in a completely bipartisan way as well. How are we at the stage where we've got another showdown between Trump and Biden 4 years later? How has the communications got to the point where the electorate has not moved to find, for want of a better word, better candidates?
Well, I mean, better candidates is, I don't know if there are better candidates. So, So I think what's interesting about these two is that they're at the total end, right? They can go no further. That is, even if Trump wins, he can only serve 2 terms for 8 years total. So 2028 is done, and then Biden, would serve 2 terms. I think we're here because, historically, I think this isn't like if you did 200 years of analysis, like this would probably happen, right? So I think it's more of this is just kind of a natural situation. And to get elected in the States, it requires a tremendous amount of bravado, ego, and you got to be well known. I mean, you're dealing with a continental, situation, 330 million people, etc. Also, I think there's a lot of vested interest that both see Biden and Trump as vessels to get their job done, right? So a lot of times when a president is put forward, he's just seen as the best possible person to carry forward the agenda. And that has a lot more to do with it. So I think what's interesting is that these two in many ways are figureheads. On the Democrat side, this doesn't get talked about that much, but there's a whole Obama versus Biden wing versus Clinton wing. Like there's like factions within that party. They each come different ways. Those have been like the 3 big personalities of the last 30 years, right? And they've each held the office, Clinton 8 years, Obama 8 years. So egotistically, the Biden wing wants 8 years. They want that second election. They want that second mandate. So to say that their perspective on how to run a country is proper. And that's really like an internal Democrat fight. I think what's happening on the Republican side is that Trump is just like an apex predator. He doesn't play by the same rules. He's just shameless. I mean, any normal human under this much scrutiny, this much legal jeopardy would drop out, right? But somehow Trump like feeds on this. Like he's like Godzilla coming out of Tokyo Bay. He's like an anomaly, like something we've never seen before. And in many ways, I think he's like a dying star. Eventually he's going to like burn out. But he's such a unique, crazy figure that he doesn't play by any of the same rules. So I think his survival and the reason he just continues to plow forward, he's just like a one-off. He's like, to me, he's like Leicester City winning the Premier League, right? I mean, Leicester City is going to win the Premier League once every 100 years. And Trump is kind of like the same kind of situation, right? And I think we're just in that kind of weird time.
I think to an extent, he's a reflection of the times he lives in, because we were talking earlier about how competitive the attention economy is these days, right? Everybody is indeed communicating to an extent that they never had. And I'll tell you this, when Trump was president, I have never seen a single person or issue dominate news and media and social media and communication like him. Just absolutely dominated the bandwidth, the communications bandwidth that we have globally. And I don't think I went 6 hours without seeing a story or talk about Trump during his presidency.
So when he came down so I've been doing Republican politics for, my whole life. So when he came down the elevator in 2015 to announce his run for president, I was like, this guy is going to be a problem, because everything he was saying had been talked about, but had never gotten into the Oval Office, right? It'd been like, if you spend a lot of time with crazy Republicans, like this stuff is talked about all the time. Everything Trump said, he just weaponized it and took it to a new level. And his ability to completely be shameless and not care, and just, he is like a Sun newspaper, New York Post pro, and he lives in that kind of Daily Mail, Vox media, populist, and he knows how to play it. And he's a really good communicator. You may hate everything he stands for, but he knows what the hell he's doing. And his shamelessness is just something we've never seen before, because he just won't stop. It's insane.
Love him or hate him, he's the ultimate polarizing figure. I know it's a little bit less contentious in the UK. Don't get me wrong, he still causes a lot of conversations. But whenever I make trips to the US, people legitimately can be on the extremes of worshipping him or absolutely despising him. And that kind of the edge cases, I don't think you quite see that in the UK, but I find it absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned the kind of weaponization there, and I'm wondering, do you think politics in general is becoming more weaponized? Again, because of this age we're living in, where if you want to communicate effectively, you have to make a louder message or a more effective message to cut through everything else. We're seeing Trump being impeached twice. Who is that guy? Mayorkas, the Homeland Secretary. He got recently impeached. To what extent do you think this is almost a communication strategy of, we want to be seen, our party, as being effective. We've got to make louder noise, more extreme things to actually, get on news, get on social media?
Well, I think it gets back to, I don't think, listen, today I woke up, the power's on, the water's running, the street lights are working, my trash got picked up, like the communists haven't invaded Hawaii. So the governments are working, right? Presumably everything in the UK is running, governments are working. So what I'm trying to say is, I think getting back to that media attention around Musk versus Farley versus Barra, the media now is just focusing on these extreme voices because they're interesting, because they're entertaining. What's happened with political coverage? If you watch Sky, read Politico, MSNBC, it's ESPN. It's like sports. They're just covering politics like a horse race. Who's up, who's down, what's the gossip? There's really no in-depth discussion about policy. It's all bumper sticker, quick solutions to complex problems, like the border, good or bad, build a wall, don't build a wall. Immigration is far more complex than, whether or not to build a wall. Build a wall sounds interesting. It's quick, easy to digest. Yes, no, I understand that. So what I'm saying is, in many ways, the media is giving attention and traction to the fringes on all sides. It's not even just Trump. It's also, on the left, like Corbyn. Like if Corbyn today wanted to say, he could get so much media attention, right? If he just walked out, you look at the struggles with the Labour Party, around anti-Jewish rhetoric. I mean, they've had to expel like 2 members of the party, right? And these kind of extremes are getting all the attention. But there's 200 other. I don't know how many members of the Labour Party there are in the parliament right now. But there's 200, 300 other normal, quote unquote, members of the Labour Party that are doing their jobs, not creating a ruckus, right? And the same with the member Capitol Hill. There's 435 members of the House of Representatives. There's probably 30 that get 90% of all the media attention, right? Most members of Congress get up, do their job, help constituents, try to move legislation, cut the ribbon, go to the Little League games, walk in the parade, like they're normal politicians. I think what the media now is just covering such extremes because what they've had to go mass. Like for you and me to go niche, we can do that like on social, YouTube, Twitter, etc. But if you're a mass broadcaster like ITV, Sky News, MSNBC, CNN, like you have to get the biggest well-known people on your program. And it's like we're in this self-perpetuating loop of mass broadcast. So Food TV, there must be equivalent in the UK, but Food TV, Food Network in the States, when it started, it had high-end French chefs, right? Like Jacques Pepin and, creating these elaborate meals. And now if you turn on Fox or Food Network, it's visiting diners. It's like Beat Bobby Flay. It's like very mass, easy to digest. It's not complex French food. And as soon as you decide to go mass, you go more basic. And I think we're seeing that in our media coverage, and they're covering the most basic populist politicians to the detriment of, I think, needed debate around complex issues. But it's becoming much more entertainment. That's the real message.
It absolutely is. It feels a bit like a circus at times. It's that paradox, isn't it, where we've never been able to communicate more easily or had so many channels to communicate, which is great. But there's then that paradox of it's created huge power laws, like you were saying, where 10% of people get 90% of all the attention. So you can communicate far more easily than you've ever been able to, but you're also getting drowned out, and so you have to talk louder or shout louder. Okay, I want to change tack a little bit. We're about 2/3 of the way through. I want to change tack a little bit now and talk about AI. I know you've done some work at the Center for AI Policy, and obviously AI is absolutely huge right now. You cannot turn on the TV or go anywhere without hearing about it. I don't want to talk about Nvidia's share price or anything like that because everyone's talking about that.
Why not, man? Did you see yesterday, it added almost $300 billion to their market cap. I mean, they just passed $2 trillion. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. It's unbelievable.
I don't want to have a conversation about whether it's in a bubble or not, but what I'm interested in about AI policy itself. And, I think the IPO, there was recently a case and they argued that AI can't have patent rights. And I think they took it to the Supreme Court and they dismissed the appeal, and they've concluded that an inventor has to be a person. An AI cannot be named as an inventor to secure patent rights. And for me, that's just one of 100 of really fascinating areas that are going to happen with AI policy. Where do you see this going? Do you think it's going to explode, or do you think we're going to reach a kind of equilibrium in terms of policy making?
So I think it's important to step back and just say what AI is. I mean, at the end of the day, it's software, right? That can make calculations quicker. I think is the way to think about it. Like, if we do a quick math quiz, if we do like 5 + 2, now you probably already know the answer, right? Like 7 came to your head like immediately, right? Like that's like AI. Like, how did that happen? You just know it's 7. Whereas if I don't know it's 7, I can use my fingers. I can count serially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? That's kind of like software versus AI. Does that make sense? So that's happening. And then there's also the backlash on Trump 2016 social media. There's a lot of angst that governments didn't do enough to kind of rein in social media under the guise of innovation, let this technology go free. And it's created, all kinds of societal damage. So there's an idea that tech, AI in particular, needs to be regulated. So the question is, like, how do you regulate it? What's the best platform? How do you not stifle innovation? But clearly software is going to be much more regulated going forward. There's no doubt about that. And I think the other big global trend around AI or any technology in general is there's going to be a lot more data localization. This idea of internet will still be there, but you're going to see the rise of much more of intranet, whereas India will have its own rules, China, the UK, EU, US, which is going to make it really interesting. You're already seeing that now with the back end stuff, like who can buy chips, who can build cloud computing, how much, the semiconductor industry, how it's being restricted. The Dutch company AMSL can only sell their machines that make chips to essentially NATO countries, right? So it's like happening, but it's not as pervasive as we see it. But I think those are like the two big trends. For me, what's interesting about AI from a policy perspective is that fine line between the promise and peril, and how do you control and regulate without stifling innovation? That's like the real challenge that we're facing. But the wild west of the internet is going to be reined in for sure going forward. So I think has to be voices that, that can talk about this, that can represent various interests, how this technology is going to help and hinder humanity going forward. That was a heavy answer for Frada.
I think you're right. Wild West is a really interesting. I think you're absolutely correct. I think policy in general and law is going to be challenged. We're going to go through this disruptive period, and let's take for example, AI in self-driving cars. I think we're going to start seeing. I think it was Mercedes. I might be wrong. I think it was Mercedes who were the first automobile company that said they are going to accept liability if an AI autopilot on their cars kills a pedestrian or causes an accident. It might not be kills a pedestrian, but causes an accident. And they are going to accept liability as a company, not the driver through their insurance company. And I was really shocked when I heard that for two reasons. A, because I think autopilot is still in its infancy, despite what a lot of marketing teams will have you believe. And B, for a company to accept liability, unwaveringly like that is pretty unusual. And maybe it's a marketing stunt in and of itself, but I feel like we're going to have a lot of precedent-setting court cases happen in the next 10 or 15 years related to things like this within AI.
That's super. Yeah. So it's interesting. I had no idea about this Benz thing. I just looked it up. That's super interesting. Yeah. Now, this is like really interesting. Like me personally. So I grew up in the Motor City in Detroit, and one of my uncles worked for Ford on the legal team. And if you remember the Pinto car, they put the gas tank so close to the fender, in the back fender, that if it was hit in a certain direction, the car literally would blow up. And it was a huge, obviously, legal problem. There was tons of liability. And to your point about who's responsible for the safety and all this stuff, who's liable for these accidents. So just understanding the auto industry and thinking about AI and tech in general, I think AI is probably overused. When we just talk about tech in general going forward, the auto industry is super interesting. So yeah, it was the Wild West. Like you would just have a car without horses driving around town, right? Like even like 100 years ago. And now you think about the auto industry, it's regulated globally. It's regulated at the national level. It's regulated at the state and county level, right? It's regulated at the city level. Like London is going to have their own tariff system, right? On who can drive into the city, right? So I think AI is going to go the same way in terms of tech. Like there's just going to be 100 years of regulations that we're looking at to kind of sort out how to use this tech and technology in general. And so there's that data point. And then I think about when I started my career in DC, I worked on the Microsoft antitrust case for Microsoft. And this is going back to the aughts. Essentially, the U.S. government wanted to break up Microsoft, and we led a campaign. We were vehemently against that. We were working for Microsoft. Obviously, their interests were to keep the company together, not be regulated, not turn Microsoft into a utility like electricity or water, et cetera. And the messaging there was like innovation, freedom, the government's too slow, all this stuff. And it won the day. But you're flash forward 30 years now, there's going to be a lot more regulation. In fact, companies now are asking for regulation because they want to have a clear, defined rules of the road. We're crossing our metaphors again. The auto industry is a good example of where technology is going to go in terms of regulation and oversight.
That's really interesting. The long-term effects, whether you think AI is going to be world-changing or not, I think to any degree we are in kind of that hype phase at the moment. Now, we can have a long discussion about whether that hype is justified or not. But what I do see happening is it's like when you saw the invention of the computer or the airplane or these other world-changing technologies. It takes 20, 30 years to really start seeing the impact that's going to have down the chain. And it takes maybe it will be a bit quicker than that as time goes on, but maybe another 10 years before we see what's really happening beyond some of the cool tricks we're seeing now. And maybe that will give us a bit of breathing room in terms of how we think about AI regulation and how that impacts liability and other laws we have. I've got to confess, before we came on this, I did want to talk to you about AI, and I thought it would be quite cool to turn the tables a little bit on you. So what I did is I went to ChatGPT and I asked it. I said, as ChatGPT.
Which version? I'm just sad. What version are you using?
This is version 4.
Okay.
So I think that's the latest one.
Are you paying for it?
I am.
Look at you. I love it.
I asked it, as ChatGPT, what question would you most want to ask a communications director at the center of AI policy? And this is what it said. This is how it responded. So this is ChatGPT's question for you, Mark. What measures do you believe are essential to safeguard against the potential exploitation of AI-driven disinformation campaigns shaping public and policy decisions?
Wow. So
I was impressed. I thought it was slightly sinister. That it was, it's basically saying, hey, I'm going to try and manipulate you guys. But I was impressed with the lucidity of what it came up with.
Yeah, I love it. That must be, so do you want me to answer that? Or should I get a ChatGPT to see what the answer should be?
You can if you want.
No, I think what's interesting. So the Center for AI Policy, we've got like a menu. There's like 10 policies that we're focused on. Everything from like deepfakes, IP protection, to compute. Like who can, if you and me spend $1 trillion, NVIDIA chips, and we set up our own cloud, if you will, our own model, like should that be illegal? Like who should have access to even the hardware, right? Or how do you track this kind of stuff? I think that's where the debate is going. It's still early days. Obviously the EU's done some interesting stuff. The UK last fall hosted that summit. And in the US, Biden has put out an EO. A lot of it is just kind of like setting the foundation, where it's still early days on how to regulate this stuff for a number of reasons. But I think disinformation is going to be a challenge. I don't know if you saw the story yesterday. Google Gemini pulled down that AI model because when people were asking it to create images around the founding fathers, or it had, Nazis dressed as African Americans, like it just didn't connect, right? And think about, you're seeing stuff every day where software is failing for whatever reason, cyber attacks maliciously, or like AT&T was down, like their mobile network was down for half the day yesterday, right? Here in the States. It's software fails on a daily basis, right? The question is like, how serious, what's the liability, who's going to pay for it, et cetera. Those are like kind of like the bigger issues from a policy perspective. Disinformation's always happened though, right? Like that's not anything new. I think what's interesting about disinformation using tech is that it can just move so fast and scale up so quickly, unlike the printing press or somebody going down to what's the famous corner in Hyde Park, right? Speaker's Corner. Like I could go to the Speaker's Corner and just start shouting rubbish. I can myself do disinformation, but if I'm at the Speaker's Corner, it's only going to be limited to the 20 or 30 lunatics that are there listening to me. Whereas with AI, obviously it can move so much faster, or software in general. So some of these issues, what's interesting about disinformation is that humans are getting back to humanity. Humans are wired for disinformation, right? We lie, we cheat, we steal, we tell fibs, we entertain ourselves, we make up stories. So disinformation can be for fun, can be for entertainment, can be for malicious. And in some ways, like, should technology, quote unquote, be responsible for a human, like getting back to O'Shaughnessy, he always talks about human OS, right? Like, humans are designed to give disinformation, right? And so the question is this a technology problem or is this a society problem, right? Or is it just like the way humans are wired? Do you know what I'm trying to say? So I think what's interesting about tech, like cars are going to kill people, but they're also going to save somebody and drive them to the hospital. So this is all happening in real time today. And I think wrestling with that, who's responsible, who's liable. The Bench example you brought in is super interesting because they're saying, listen, we believe in this technology so much. We think it's the way forward. We're actually going to take on the liability. Mm-hmm. Is an interesting statement. So you could see more companies stepping forward saying, hey, if you use this tech, we're going to be responsible for X, Y, and Z. Because that could be going forward. That could be the sign of quality control. AI is everything from ChatGPT to there's a company in Louisiana that's going to help police fill out police reports quicker. right? So it's like this narrow niche AI technology versus these massive language models, and it all gets lumped in together. So you could see technology companies, software companies saying like, we guarantee, or we will take on the liability, or we, X, Y, and Z if this software fails. I think that's going to be like the next evolution of technology. Right now, nobody's taking responsibility for any software or social media. Like, Facebook's like, oh, we can't stop this stuff. Oh, blah, blah, blah. So we're at a very interesting inflection point. And I think what's interesting about AI and tech in general is that there's a great book I read called The Atlas of AI, and it just talks about the physical nature of software, of cloud, of AI. Because the only people right now that are making any money are NVIDIA, right? It's like the guys selling the shovels to the gold miners, right? NVIDIA is just selling you the hardware to make this possible, right? And in many ways, humanity has gone from, we used to go into the earth to dig mines, to extract that, to build skyscrapers. And now this is just like the next evolution. We're building this other physical infrastructure that's physical, but also amorphous. And the only people right now making any money around AI seem to be NVIDIA, who are selling the shovels, contractors building cloud computing stations. The software hasn't made as much money as the hardware currently, which is, to me, is super interesting.
I mean, I would love to just do a whole hour on this, and I'm not negative about AI, but I do think you're absolutely right. It's got this definite feeling of selling shovels to a gold rush. I think if you break down NVIDIA's statement, I think something like 60% of their revenue came from essentially 4 big companies. But, I think it was Amazon, Google, buying these chips, and it's not going to be that long before they're like, well, let's just make our own chips, or, competitors step in. I think what's really, really interesting, Mark, you talked about this not being a tech problem, being a societal problem. And I think you're spot on there, because, we've always had propaganda. We've always had, it's always sparked an arms race when they were printing propaganda sheets. Then, the Allies were parachuting leaflets and they still do, into North Korea at a low-tech level. And then when the internet appeared and you started getting bots, because we've had bots for 2 decades now, and these botnets where computer hackers would implant a virus in your PC that would lay dormant, and then they would take over millions of PCs, this huge botnet at their control, and then when the time was right, flip a switch, and you could do a distributed, coordinated attack on, government high commercial targets. We're just seeing the next iteration of that. For now, LLMs are extremely computationally expensive, so they're confined to large cloud data centers. Once people can start running an LLM on their laptop, which I think we're almost there, to be honest, you're going to see this. You're going to see the latest generation of botnets, which are millions of LLM-capable bots swarming on social media. But optimistically, we're also going to see what happened with the last generation of bots, which was the great innovation in, firewalls, antiviral software, things like that. So, I do think we're going to see this arms race happening between AI and anti-AI. But absolutely, I totally agree with you. I think it's absolutely profound insight that this is at its heart societal. There's no, this tech is profoundly era changing. It, human nature, going back to what we're talking about politics, human nature will not change. And I think we're almost out of time there, Mark. These conversations, this hour always goes so quickly, and I always have so many more questions. But in the last sort of 2 or 3 minutes we've got left, is there anything you wanted to talk about? Is there anything you want to plug? Anything you're doing you want to tell listeners about? Obviously, any books, any events, any websites, any blogs, we'll post links to that on all of our channels. But yeah, go ahead. Anything you want to give a shout out to?
This week, getting back to the hardware store, the question, I don't know if you saw the story, Seb, but the U.S. government, Joe Biden was in L.A., the port of L.A., and the U.S. government's going to spend $20 billion, building the domestic shipping crane industry and also retrofitting all the cranes in existence, because there's a fear, to your point, that all these cranes that were bought from Chinese companies have been implanted with some bot, some chip, just waiting to disrupt shipping, commerce, unloading, ships, freighters at the port of LA, the port of Savannah. Pretty wild stuff. Now, I suspect that the government knows that, but getting back to human nature, it's just like, oh shit. like the Chinese could do X, Y, and Z. We need to protect ourselves. Like, oh my God, my enemy could do this. I need to, so at the core of it, the technology is really being dragged by how humans interact with it, which I think is super important and something to think about going forward. I agree with your point about AI. The buzz machine about it is just so maddening. I just feel like a year ago we were talking about Bitcoin and blockchain and, metaverse, like all these things Silicon Valley threw out. None of them really caught fire, but somehow AI has become a catch-all for everything. There's a tulip mania. Humans are weird kind of situation. The big projects, I don't have any big announcements. There's some stuff I'm, kind of doing in the background. I'll probably talk about later this summer. In the short term, I'm excited this is going to be a fun project. I'm going to Detroit to see a baseball game in early April, which I've never done. And part of the celebration of baseball being back. And, I've been trying to think about spending more time in Detroit. I don't know if you've been there, Seb, but Detroit's interesting because it's gone through the boom and bust. And, in the 60s, it had almost 2 million people living in the city. And in many ways, it was Silicon Valley of America. And it missed the booms of the 70s and 80s. And the architecture is still stuck in the 50s and 60s. So it has this amazing architecture and cool vibe. So personally, my goal is to spend more time in Detroit over the coming years, my hometown, and be part of something that, there's some new interesting stuff going on around automotive, tech, humans. What I've always loved about Detroit is that when you build a car, you think about it for 2 or 3 years and you launch this thing and then you try to sell it and you're trying to capture the zeitgeist, the marketing, the communications, the vibe. And you're also building a machine with thousands of parts, the most complicated supply chain in the world, and you hope it sells. And I think the auto industry to me is super interesting. I hope professionally to do more work in that space going forward. And I want to spend more time in Detroit. I think that every great nation in the world has a robust auto industry. And it's something that isn't as sexy, isn't as cool as maybe NVIDIA or leather jackets and CEOs and, Silicon Valley. But I don't think we should sleep on autos. I think they're a powerful tool. They combine so many aspects of humanity, marketing, technology, mobility, freedom, that I don't know. I want to spend more time in that space.
Interesting. Really, really fascinating. All right, Marc, again, thank you so much. You've been a fantastic guest. Really, really enjoyed this. That's all for now. Thank you. Thank you so much.
This was great. It went by faster than I thought. I loved it.